January 10th, 2021. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stands before cameras in a carefully staged presentation. Behind him, screens display sleek renderings of a mirrored city stretching across the desert. His voice is calm, measured, absolute. A civilizational revolution that puts humans first. A city that delivers new wonders for the world. The line. A revolution in urban living. The specifications followed: 170 kilometers long, 500 meters tall, 200 meters wide, 0 cars, 0 streets, 0 carbon emissions, 9 million residents living in a single continuous structure. The watching world had questions. Architects had questions. Engineers had questions. Urban planners had questions. Physicists had questions. But inside Saudi Arabia, inside the halls of power where the line would be funded and built, there was only one response permitted. Yes, Your Royal Highness. This is the story of what happens when unlimited money meets unlimited power meets unlimited ambition. And a single word that could have saved billions of dollars was never spoken. That word was impossible. Nobody, Said, Italiano, nobody could say it. And a nation spent $50 billion learning what any first-year engineering student could have explained for free. To understand why the line failed, you must first understand the man who created it. Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud MBS. Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Chairman of the Council of Economic and Development Affairs, Chairman of the Public Investment Fund. The most powerful person in the kingdom, second only technically to his aging father, King Salman. In practice, MBS rules absolutely. He controls the money. The Public Investment Fund manages over $700 billion in assets. Every major investment, every mega project, every economic initiative flows through MBS. He controls the military. As Minister of Defense, he commands the armed forces. The war in Yemen was his decision. Its continuation is his decision. He controls succession. In 2017, he orchestrated his own elevation to Crown Prince, displacing his cousin Mohammed bin Naif in a palace maneuver that shocked even seasoned Saudi watchers. Bin Naif was placed under house arrest. He has not been seen publicly since. He controls dissent. The 2017 Ritz-Carlton roundup saw hundreds of Saudi princes, businessmen, and officials detained in a luxury hotel turned prison. They emerged poorer, humbled, and absolutely loyal. Those who weren't loyal disappeared. And he controls narrative. Jamal Khashoggi learned this on October 2nd, 2018, when he walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and never walked out. This is the man who announced the line. This is the man whose vision could not be questioned. In the entire kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with its 35 million people, its hundreds of thousands of government employees, its thousands of engineers and planners and consultants, there was not one person with the authority, the security, or the courage to say, "Your Royal Highness, this cannot be built." According to extensive reporting by the Financial Times, Bloomberg, and the Wall Street Journal, the line's specifications were not the result of engineering studies. They were not derived from feasibility analyses. They were not calculated from urban planning principles. They came from MBS himself. The length, 170 kilometers. Why 170? Because it sounded impressive. Because it would be the longest structure ever built. Because Mohammed bin Salman wanted it to be 170 kilometers. The height, 500 meters. Why 500? Because it would rival the world's tallest buildings. Because it would be visible from space. Because Mohammed bin Salman wanted it to be 500 meters. The width, 200 meters. Why 200? This specification reportedly caused the most internal debate. Engineers suggested wider. Urban planners begged for wider. Some proposals called for 400 meters. 600 meters. A full kilometer. The answer came back. 200 meters. Why? According to sources who spoke to the Financial Times, the 200-meter width was chosen for aesthetic reasons. MBS wanted the walls to feel close. He wanted residents to experience the intimacy of a canyon. He wanted the visual drama of two mirror surfaces, nearly touching as they stretched to the horizon. Engineering reality was not consulted. When engineers pointed out that 200 meters could not accommodate the infrastructure required for 9 million people, they were told to find solutions. When architects explained that 500 meters created impossible thermodynamics, they were told to innovate. When urban planners demonstrated that 170 kilometers of continuous structure would cost more than the entire GDP of most nations, they were told that money was not a constraint. The specifications were not negotiable. The specifications were royal decree. Inside the offices of NEOM, inside the consulting firms hired to make the line real, inside the architectural studios contracted to design it, a culture of silence took hold. Multiple sources who worked on the line have described the atmosphere to journalists, always on condition of anonymity, always with palpable fear, even years after leaving the project. One pattern emerged consistently: the cascade of impossible promises. MBS would announce a specification. His deputies would translate that specification into requirements for the technical teams. The technical teams would analyze the requirements and discover they were physically impossible. The technical teams would prepare presentations explaining the impossibility. The presentations would never reach MBS. Somewhere in the chain of command, someone would intercept the bad news. The technical teams would be told to revise their analysis, find efficiencies, assume technological breakthroughs, project optimistic scenarios. The revised presentations would show the project as difficult but achievable. These revised presentations would reach MBS, and MBS would demand faster timelines and more ambitious targets, because clearly the technical teams were being too conservative. The cycle would repeat. One consultant described it this way to the Financial Times: there was a systematic gap between what we told middle management and what middle management told leadership. Everyone knew the numbers didn't work, but nobody wanted to be the one to say it. People had seen what happened to people who said the wrong thing. What happened to people who said the wrong thing? They were removed from the project. Their contracts were terminated. Their visas were revoked. In some cases, they were questioned by security services before being allowed to leave the country. The message was unmistakable. Optimism was rewarded. Realism was punished. And honesty about impossibility was career suicide. They knew from the beginning. The structural engineers knew that a 500-meter-tall continuous wall could not stand without foundation systems. Unprecedented in human history. They calculated the loads. They modeled the stresses. They understood that the geology beneath the line varied wildly and would require different solutions every few kilometers. They said nothing to leadership that leadership didn't want to hear. The thermal engineers knew that two parallel mirror surfaces would create a heat trap of extraordinary intensity. They modeled the solar radiation. They calculated the temperatures in the canyon between the walls. They predicted that certain sections would become uninhabitable during summer months. They suggested design modifications. The modifications were rejected as contrary to the vision. The transportation engineers knew that moving 9 million people through a 200-meter-wide structure would require elevator and rail systems beyond any ever constructed. They estimated 400,000 elevators. They calculated the energy requirements. They determined that the promised 20-minute transit time from end to end was physically impossible with any known or projected technology. They adjusted their models until the numbers looked achievable. The water engineers knew that supplying 9 million people in a desert environment would require desalination at unprecedented scale. They calculated the pipeline requirements. They estimated the pumping energy needed to push water 170 kilometers and 500 meters vertically. They understood that the system would be the most complex water infrastructure ever attempted. They presented optimistic projections. The urban planners knew that the promised density 265,000 people per square kilometer exceeded any human habitation in history by a factor of 3 or more. They knew that the allocated living space, approximately 26 square meters per resident, was barely above capsule hotel standards. They knew that the services required hospitals, schools, shops, recreation could not fit within the specified dimensions. They redesigned repeatedly. each iteration slightly less impossible than the last. None of them actually feasible. Every discipline knew. The knowledge was siloed, shared in whispers, documented in files that were never forwarded upward. The collective expertise of thousands of professionals, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of engineering and urban development, crashed against the wall of one man's certainty. The expertise lost. McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, Oliver Wyman. The most prestigious names in global consulting flocked to the line. Their role was ostensibly to provide independent analysis, strategic guidance, reality testing. What they actually provided was validation. The economics of consulting in Saudi Arabia are compelling. Day rates that exceed what consultants earn anywhere else in the world. Multi-year contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Access to the largest sovereign wealth fund on earth. The opportunity to shape the future of a nation. The economics of honesty in Saudi Arabia are less compelling. Consulting firms that told MBS what he wanted to hear received more contracts. Consulting firms that raised concerns found their engagements shortened, their teams reduced, their access limited. The market selected for optimism. According to sources who spoke to various publications, the consulting firms produced reports that were masterpieces of strategic ambiguity. They would note challenges without calling them insurmountable. They would flag risks without quantifying their probability. They would recommend further study without concluding that further study would reveal impossibility. The reports gave leadership just enough cover to proceed. They gave the consultants just enough deniability to claim they had warned of difficulties. They gave no one the information needed to stop a disaster in motion. One former consultant, speaking anonymously to Bloomberg, described the dynamic. Our job was to make the impossible sound difficult. There's a big difference. Difficult can be overcome with money and will. Impossible can't. But we never used the word impossible. That word didn't exist in our vocabulary on this project. The consulting firms collected their fees. The project proceeded. The impossible remained impossible, regardless of how it was described. Not everyone stayed silent. Norman Foster, perhaps the most celebrated living architect, was initially involved with NEOM. His firm, Foster Plus Partners, has designed some of the world's most ambitious structures. If anyone could make the line work, surely it was Foster. Foster withdrew. The withdrawal was quiet. No public statements. No dramatic denunciations. Simply a gradual reduction of involvement, followed by absence. Sources suggest that Foster's team identified fundamental problems they could not solve and could not ignore. Rather than attach their name to a project they believed would fail, they stepped back. Francine Hauban of Mecca No, another architect of international renown, also reportedly distanced herself from NEOM after initial involvement. The pattern repeated across the industry. The most established architects, those with reputations too valuable to risk on a doomed project, found ways to exit. Who remained? Younger firms hungry for the exposure. Lesser-known architects, willing to take the risk. Consultants and designers who calculated that the fees were worth the reputational gamble. And the in-house team at NEOM, who had no choice. The exodus of established architects should have been a warning sign. In the outside world, when the best professionals refuse to work on a project, the project is typically in MBS's Saudi Arabia, the exodus was interpreted differently. The departing architects lacked vision. They were too conservative. They couldn't see the revolutionary potential. The project continued. The specifications remained unchanged. The impossible was still impossible. But now it was being designed by those who either didn't recognize impossibility or didn't dare acknowledge it. Money reveals truth. The original budget for the line was $500 billion. Already an almost incomprehensible sum more than the GDP of Sweden. More than twice the cost of the International Space Station. More than any single construction project in human history. But $500 billion was a fiction. As engineering reality intruded, as the specifications collided with physics, the budget began its inexorable climb. First revision, $1.6 trillion. Second revision, $2.4 trillion. Third revision, $4.5 trillion. Final leaked estimate before the project was scaled back, $8.8 trillion. $8.8 trillion. For context, $8.8 trillion is larger than the GDP of every country on Earth, except the United States and China. It is more than the combined GDP of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. It is approximately half of the entire annual economic output of the United States for a single building. The budget escalation was the ultimate proof of what the engineers, the architects, the consultants, and the urban planners all knew. The line as specified could not be built. Couldn't be built cheaply. Couldn't be built quickly. Couldn't be built at all. At any cost, with any timeline, using any known or foreseeable technology. The $8.8 trillion figure represented not a plan, but a capitulation. It was the financial equivalent of admitting that no amount of money could make the impossible possible. But the figure was never presented to MBs in those terms. It was presented as an investment opportunity, a generational project, a legacy that would outlast pyramids. The language of failure was translated into the language of ambition, and $50 billion was spent before reality finally intervened. In late 2024, the line was quietly scaled back. 170 kilometers became 2.4 kilometers. 9 million residents became 300,000. The revolutionary city that would transform human existence became a single building complex. Impressive by normal standards, insignificant compared to the original vision. $50 billion had been spent. 6,000 foundation piles stood in the desert, supporting nothing. Thousands of workers had labored in brutal conditions. At least one man, Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti, had been killed for opposing the project's displacement of his tribe. 3 of his relatives faced death sentences for refusing to leave their ancestral lands, and the lesson was clear. Written in concrete and steel and human suffering across the Saudi desert. Nobody could say impossible. This is what happens when power becomes absolute. When wealth removes all friction. When Yasmin replaced truth-tellers. When the market selects for optimism and punishes realism. When every institution that should provide checks and balances instead provides validation and enablement. The line failed, not because the engineering was flawed. The line failed not because the budget was insufficient, though $50 billion barely scratched the surface. The line failed not because the technology didn't exist, though much of it didn't. The line failed because one man's vision could not be questioned, and his vision was impossible. Every engineer knew. Every architect knew. Every consultant knew. Every urban planner knew. They knew from the specifications. They knew from the first calculations. They knew from basic physics that any student learns in introductory coursework, and not one of them could say the word. Not one of them could stand before Mohammed bin Salman and speak the truth that would have saved $50 billion. Saved years of wasted effort. Saved the lives and freedoms of those who suffered for this fantasy. The truth was simple. This cannot be built. 6 words. Nobody spoke them. In the silence of those 6 words lies the epitaph of the line, and a warning for every society that allows power to become so concentrated that reality itself becomes a matter of royal opinion. The desert doesn't care about titles. Physics doesn't negotiate with princes. The impossible remains impossible, no matter who decrees otherwise. MBS learned this at a cost of $50 billion. The question that remains, what else might he learn? And at what cost? The foundation piles stand in the desert, monuments to a simple truth that nobody could speak. Some projects fail because they are too ambitious. The line failed because ambition was mandatory and honesty was forbidden. In the end, that is the only lesson that matters.